The Deadly Rumor and 2 Other Terrifying True Stories, MrBallen Podcast Episode 487, 65 minutes. In 1995, a mother of 3 called 911 on her own 15-year-old son for stealing a payphone. Within 24 hours, she had been kidnapped from her bedroom, sexually assaulted, and beaten to death with a chipping hammer. Her killer lived across the street. He had been watching her house, waiting for the lights to go out, and the only reason detectives ever caught him was because of a neighborhood rumor that took nearly a year to surface. Plus 2 more stories that will leave you genuinely unsettled. An entire ship's crew frozen in time for 16 years, and a doomed Arctic expedition where explorers descended into madness and cannibalism because of their own canned food. Section 1, A Mother's Impossible Choice. Bonnie Sanborn was a 41-year-old mother living in Tucson, Arizona with her 3 children, 15-year-old Bradley, 13-year-old Candace, and 10-year-old Brandon. Her husband Robert was working in Maryland and only came home every other weekend. Bonnie was essentially a single parent trying to hold her family together, and it was not going well. Bradley was a serious problem. He threw unauthorized parties, picked fights with every family member, and hung out with known gang members. On the morning of December 8, 1995, Bonnie walked into Bradley's bedroom and found him squatting on the floor with his 18-year-old friend Jason Horbashevsky, prying open a stolen payphone with a crowbar and a hammer. They were trying to steal the quarters inside. Bonnie had reached her breaking point. She walked to the kitchen, picked up the phone, and called 911 on her own son. Deputies she already recognized arrived and handcuffed both Bradley and Jason. As they were being loaded into the squad car, Bonnie pulled a deputy aside and asked him to make sure Bradley spent at least 1 night in juvenile detention. She was hoping the Scared Straight experience combined with counseling would turn things around. But as the squad car drove away, Bonnie noticed a neighbor watching through their curtains. Joggers on the street stared at the scene. She knew the neighborhood already gossiped constantly about her family's problems. What she did not know was that someone far more dangerous than a gossip was watching too. Section 2, Blood in the Bedroom. Just before 3 a.m. the following morning, Bonnie shouted from her bedroom for Candace and Brandon to turn off the TV and go to bed. They did. Those were the last words her children ever heard from her. When 10-year-old Brandon woke up around 10:45 a.m. that Saturday, the house was eerily silent. No breakfast cooking, no coffee in the pot. He and Candace went to their mother's bedroom door, knocked, got no answer, and pushed it open. The bedroom was covered in blood, blood on the walls, blood on the windows, blood soaking the entire mattress, but Bonnie was not there. Detective Brad Faust arrived to find what was clearly a horrifically violent crime scene. A folding knife with a red handle sat on the bloody mattress. Bonnie's purse had been dumped out, but nothing appeared to be stolen. Credit cards and a checkbook were still on the bed. There was a bloody handprint on one of the pillows. On the floor by the bed, Faust found a small brown button that did not match any of Bonnie's clothing. Most critically, Faust found a trail of blood droplets leading from the bed to the sliding glass door that opened into the backyard. The door was unlocked. The blood trail continued across the grass to the garage, where there were no drag marks, meaning whoever attacked Bonnie had carried her. The garage was empty. Bonnie's light blue Chrysler was gone. The killer had beaten Bonnie in her bed, carried her through the house and yard, loaded her into her own car, and driven away. Section 3, Dead Ends and DNA. Faust began working through suspects systematically. Bradley was ruled out immediately since he was locked up in juvenile detention during the attack, but Bradley's friend Jason was an interesting lead. Jason was 18, a known gang member, and reportedly carried a knife that he sometimes used to stab himself in the head. He had motive for revenge since Bonnie had called the cops on him just that morning. When Faust brought Jason in for questioning, he noticed that the buttons on Jason's shirt were small and brown, matching the button found in Bonnie's bedroom. Some buttons on the shirt appeared to be missing. Jason agreed to provide a DNA sample and surrendered his shirt, but weeks later the lab results came back negative. The DNA from the crime scene did not match Jason. The buttons were not a match either, just an unfortunate coincidence. Faust checked Bonnie's husband Robert next. Even though Robert was supposedly in Maryland, this was pre-9/11 America. You did not need to show ID for a domestic flight. Someone could fly under a fake name. Faust compiled a list of every possible flight from Maryland to Tucson that weekend and called every airline. Robert's name did not appear on any manifest, but Faust knew that did not definitively clear him. A DNA sample from Robert also came back negative. Meanwhile, the caller tip led Faust to Bonnie's car. A man out jogging with his wife had spotted the light blue Chrysler abandoned in the desert, half a mile from Bonnie's house. When police arrived, they found Bonnie slumped in the back seat. Her hands were bound behind her back. A sock was stuffed in her mouth. The lower half of her body was naked. She had been repeatedly struck in the head with something extremely sharp, had defensive wounds all over her hands and arms, and showed signs of sexual assault. The forensic team found the killer's DNA on her body. But the DNA matched nobody in the system. An anonymous tip led Faust to a drug dealer named Lyle Winstead, who had a history of knife violence and made suspicious comments about the killer just being on a bad trip. But Winstead's DNA did not match either. Section 4. The rumor that solved everything. After 9 months of dead ends, with nearly 100 murders that year keeping his department overwhelmed, Faust went back to basics. He walked door to door through Barney's neighborhood, re-interviewing every person his team had already spoken to. And at one house down the street, a woman told him she did not know anything personally, but there was a rumor circulating through the neighborhood. The rumor was about Freddie Royville, the 22-year-old man who lived directly across the street from the Sanborns. Word around the neighborhood was that Freddie had found Barney attractive. There was also another rumor floating around that a younger man in the neighborhood had previously assaulted a woman. It was thin, it was gossip, but it was enough for Faust. He ordered DNA samples from every young man on the block. When Freddie Royville's results came back, they were a match. Here is what police believe happened. Freddie had been watching the Sanborn house that night. He saw the living room light go out around 3 a.m. when the kids finally went to bed. He waited until the house was completely dark. Then, armed with flex ties and a chipping hammer, a tool with a regular hammer face on one side and a sharp pickaxe-like point on the other, he crept across the backyard to the sliding glass door. He knew it would be unlocked because he had been in the house before, having done repair work for Barney with his father. He entered Barney's bedroom, found her asleep, grabbed a sock from the floor, and before she could scream, he jammed it in her mouth. Then he struck her in the head repeatedly with the chipping hammer, spraying blood across the walls. He bound her hands, found her car keys in her purse, carried her through the backyard to the garage, loaded her into the Chrysler, and drove to the desert. There, in the back seat of the car, he sexually assaulted Barney as she died from her injuries. Then he simply walked home. Freddie Royville was arrested in January 1997, convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to life in prison. Section 5. The Ghost Ship in Drake Passage. The second story in this episode takes place in 1839, when whaling Captain Brighton was sailing through the Drake Passage along the coast of Antarctica. His ship had nearly been trapped by freezing ocean water the night before, and he was debating whether to continue deeper into the passage or turn back. That is when he spotted another ship on the horizon. As the ship got closer, Brighton could see it was a schooner, a vessel designed for travel rather than whaling. It was in rough shape, with tattered sails and a weathered hull. Brighton assumed the crew might be in trouble, possibly trapped by ice like he nearly was, so he loaded supplies onto a dinghy and rowed over with 4 of his men. When they boarded the schooner, nobody was on deck. Brighton had seen people through the portholes, so he knew there were people inside. He and his men entered the captain's quarters and found a man sitting at a desk with his back to them. Brighton called out multiple times, but the man did not respond or move. Brighton walked across the room and looked over the man's shoulder to read what he had been writing. The journal entry read, "Trapped by icebergs. Despite all efforts, the fire went out last night. No hope remains." Above it was the date, January 17, 1823, 16 years earlier. The captain and his entire crew had been dead for 16 years. The extreme cold of the Drake Passage had perfectly preserved every body in the exact position they died. Below deck, Brighton found men frozen while playing cards, a woman frozen in her bed beside her dog, people frozen in the dining hall, sitting exactly where they had been when the cold claimed them. The ship had been drifting through the passage for nearly 2 decades, a perfectly preserved snapshot of the moment an entire crew froze to death. Section 6. Lead poisoning and cannibalism in the Arctic. The final story follows a group of Inuit hunters on King William Island in northern Canada in April 1848. While heading to the coastline to hunt seals, the youngest hunter crested an icy hill and saw something that defied understanding. About 40 white men were lumbering along the coastline below. Their skin was black and blue. Their clothes were tattered. Their movements were jerky and robotic, like they were not in control of their own bodies. They stared straight ahead with vacant expressions. Several of the men were dragging a large sled covered with a tarp. As the hunters watched in horror, one of the white men screamed, collapsed, and fell to the ground. The men pulling the sled casually stopped, pulled back the tarp to reveal a pile of bodies, threw the fallen man on top, covered them up, and kept walking as if nothing had happened. The hunters retreated to their village. The consensus was that these men were starving and needed help. The next day the hunters returned with seal meat, but the white men were gone. They followed the footprints for hours until they found an abandoned campsite. Everything seemed wrong. The men had left behind supplies they should have kept, including a metal cooking pot sitting over the remains of a fire. When one of the hunters lifted the lid of the pot, he reeled back in horror. Inside was a human skull that had been cracked open. Someone had been eating the brain. Months later, the hunters found the men's ship frozen off the coast. Aboard, they discovered something astonishing. The ship was in pristine condition, comfortable beds with linens, a library of hundreds of books, a pantry stocked with canned food. There was absolutely no reason for these men to have abandoned their ship. They had everything they needed to survive. The explanation would not come for another 130 years. In the 1980s, researchers analyzed the remains and discovered that the canned food supplied by the British government for the expedition had been contaminated with lead. As the crew ate the tainted food over months, they slowly poisoned themselves. Lead poisoning causes nausea, confusion, and wild mood swings that progress into full-blown hysteria and insanity. In their madness, the crew abandoned a perfectly good ship stocked with food and shelter. They marched into the Arctic wilderness with no coherent plan. As men began dying from starvation and exposure, the survivors turned to cannibalism, dragging their dead on a sled and cooking them at campsites along the way. To this day, bones from the crew of that doomed expedition are still being found on King William Island. Key takeaways. First, the Barney Sanborn case demonstrates how proximity can be the most overlooked factor in violent crime. Her killer lived 20 feet away and had been in her home before. Detectives spent months chasing other leads while the answer was right across the street. Second, neighborhood rumors, often dismissed as gossip, can contain critical information. A single vague rumor about attraction was enough to prompt DNA testing that solved a year-old murder. Third, the ghost ship story is a haunting reminder that the natural world can preserve the dead in ways that blur the line between life and death, creating scenes that look frozen in time. Fourth, the Franklin expedition story shows how a mundane manufacturing defect, lead contamination in canned food, can cause an entire group of intelligent, well-equipped people to descend into insanity and self-destruction. Fifth, across all three stories, the common thread is that the truth was hiding in plain sight. The killer across the street, the ship floating for 16 years, the perfectly stocked vessel abandoned for no apparent reason. Sometimes the answer is right there, waiting for someone to look.